You're watching the Daily Climate Show on Sky News. Coming up on today's programme. As Russia's President Putin joins a growing list of world leaders not attending COP26, its president, Sadiq Khan, says net zero commitments from the G20 are critical to stopping global warming. A warning from the UN that the world's biggest fossil fuel producing countries must cut emissions by more than half to keep global temperatures below dangerous levels. And as London's mayor becomes chair of a global group of cities focused on fighting climate change, Sadiq Khan tells us his plans to help the capital reach net zero emissions by 2030. Hello and welcome to the UK's only daily climate news show where we track the changes that are happening to our world right now and we challenge those who are coming up with the solutions. Now, the Russian President Vladimir Putin has decided not to attend the Global Climate Summit in Glasgow, now just 11 days away. Well, he joins a list of world leaders who are not going to COP26, raising some doubt that a global agreement can be reached to ensure that the Earth's temperature does not rise to dangerous levels. But the event's president, Sadiq Khan, said he was still confident that more countries would commit to national action plans on climate change in the coming days.
I mean, Russia will send, obviously, a delegation, and we want all world leaders to come, obviously. But what will also be critical is what happens during those 2 weeks and how the individual delegations interact. Just in the last few days, announced a net zero commitment, which I think is a move forward. But obviously, it wouldn't surprise you to know that in the conversations that I've been having, I have raised the issue of the NDC, and that's the case for every country. But the G20 really matter here, Chair, because they represent 80% of global emissions. If all of them were on a pathway to 1.5 or net zero by 2050, we would be looking at limiting global warming to 1.7 degrees. That's just the actions of the G20, and that's why what they do matters so much.
Well, our climate change correspondent Hannah Thomas-Peter joins us now. Hannah, Sadiq Khan keeping his cool there, but if the big hitters don't come, does the conference lose momentum?
Of course it does. I think there is an issue here for Sadiq Khan and his team. It really does matter who turns up in person. If only for the optics, the delegations of China, because we know that President Xi Jinping is unlikely to come in person. We know that China is going to send a delegation. We don't know for sure if they're going to have a mandate to negotiate on their nation's behalf, or what their situation will be when they attend Glasgow. That's just the brutal truth of it. And Russia is less important than China, as far as negotiations go. But it still is going to sting that Putin isn't turning up in person. But I do think that we've heard an awful lot from the big players like the UK and the US who have been frantically trying to manage expectations around attendance. They have tried very hard not to get into a back and forth about who is not going to be attending. And they are constantly saying that they're not going to, attach the success of COP to physical attendance. But their actions probably speak louder than words, betray the reality of how they are thinking about the importance of attendance, because the US has made a great thing about how it is sending some 13 high-level representatives from the US government. The UK, of course, is going to do the same as host. They've made a big play of welcoming Australia's Prime Minister Scott Morrison, because he has confirmed that he is attending in person. This stuff really matters. And when you finally get down to that negotiating room, if you talk to negotiators, as I have done a lot in the past couple of weeks, when you have people in the room who have the mandate to make decisions on behalf of their nation, that is when quick progress is made on difficult issues. So, of course, Vladimir Putin saying he's not turning up in person is going to impact proceedings.
OK, well, not too late to change their minds, is it? Hannah, thank you very much indeed. Now, despite a lot of promises to cut those emissions, some of the world's biggest fossil fuel producing countries are planning to increase production of oil, coal and gas. But the annual UN Production Gap report says that they must cut production by more than half for there to be any chance of keeping global temperatures below dangerous levels. Well, let's take a look at some of those key findings. This line here, it shows emissions that are generated from fossil fuel production that the main countries expect to produce up to 2040. Well, the report analyses 15 countries. It includes the UK, China, the US and India. And it finds they are collectively projecting an increase in global oil and gas production and only a modest decrease in coal production over the next 2 decades. But many of them are promising to lower emissions or achieve net zero, which would lower their carbon emissions from fossil fuel production. And that is shown here by the green line. However, that level of emission is still more than twice the amount needed to limit global warming to 1.5 degrees by 2030. That is shown here by this yellow line.
Governments need to recognise that they must link up internally to where a major commitment is being made publicly at COP26. So, for example, countries that are formally committing to no longer build coal power stations and pivoting away, saying we will never build a coal power station. That needs to be reflected through to other parts of government that are making decisions about fossil fuel production. So the UK is a great example. We've got a policy called Maximising Economic Recovery, MER, which is effectively a policy which has been around for some time now, seems to be very hard to dislodge, which gives the UK a clear mandate to pull as much oil and gas out of the North Sea as possible. Currently, that doesn't align with the UK's quite progressive net zero targets and other climate change policies. So what we need to see is governments acting to close that gap, to make sure that the climate goals, the climate objectives that they're setting, trickle all the way down and are reflected in their fossil fuel production policies.
Now, some other climate news around today, and a hydroelectric power plant in Brazil is facing an energy crunch. That's amid record low river and rainfall levels. The Itaipu Dam, which supplies around 10% of the energy consumed in Brazil and 86% in Paraguay, has recorded its lowest output ever. Well, severe droughts linked to climate change are complicating the shift away from fossil fuels to renewable sources like hydroelectric. At least 46 people have died and several are missing after floods triggered by heavy rain hit the northern Indian state of Uttarakhand. The state has seen heavy rain for the past 3 days, flooding roads, destroying bridges and causing landslides. Meteorological experts warn that climate change has not only increased the frequency of the rains in the region, but also their intensity. And French beekeepers are anticipating the worst honey harvest in decades. Unseasonably cold and wet weather has prevented bees from producing honey, and the Beekeepers Association, UNAF, expects the overall harvest to be down to just a third of last year's. The UNAF president said that irregular weather patterns linked to climate change will have a lasting impact on honey production. Now, the Mayor of London, Sadiq Khan, is to become the next chair of the C40 Cities Network. That's a group of almost 100 major cities all around the world dedicated to addressing climate change. Now, he wants London to become a world leader in tackling air pollution and climate change, and hopes that action taken in the capital can inspire and accelerate climate measures in other cities. Well, I spoke to him a little while ago and started by asking how London can become net zero by 2030. That is his pledge 20 years before the rest of the UK.
What we can't do is have politicians kicking the can down the road with targets 20, 30 years in the future when they're not around. That's one of the reasons I'm concerned about a target of zero carbon by 2050. Our government has to reduce emissions by 68% by the end of this decade. We're nowhere near getting to that. In London, we've shown with our policies, the world's first ultra-low emission zone. One example, we now have in London more electric buses than any city in Western Europe. Since I became mayor, we now have more than a third of the charging points in the entire country, more rapid charging points than any city in Western Europe. We've got to take action now, not wait for 10 years or 20 or 30 years.
You mentioned the ultra-low emission zone coming in on the 25th of October, but 80% of London vehicles won't need to pay this, and it doesn't cover all of London, does it? So I'm just wondering whether you think you might have to tighten the parameters of it to achieve your goals, looking to Paris, for an example, which is banning all diesel cars by 2024.
Well, hold it a sec. The reason why so many of our vehicles are now compliant is because of our policies. In 2017, which is when I announced when the ULEZ would be coming in and the world's first toxicity charge came in, only 37% of vehicles were compliant. Because of our policies, more of our vehicles are compliant, ULEZ compliant, so I can only be criticised for taking action now. Look, I'm not willing to wait to 2025. We've got to take action now. So even though Paris, great city, great mayor, is in 4 years' time saying they're going to ban diesel, that does nothing to improve the quality of air. Now, at the moment in London, as we speak, there are still children whose lungs are stunted permanently because of the toxic air. Adults with a whole host of health issues, from asthma to cancer, dementia, heart disease, and more than 4,000 premature deaths every year now. 2025 is too far away.
London is not central to the government's levelling up agenda, is it? If you don't get the money that you need, will council tax bills need to rise?
Look, you don't get a national recovery without a London recovery. You don't get to zero carbon without London playing its role in doing so. And what we want to do is work with the government. We're on the same side here. The government and those of us in City Hall are united in our efforts to get to zero carbon, united in our efforts to clean up our air, but also united to have a national recovery. From City Hall, we're investing huge sums in retrofitting homes. We're also working with the private sector, with the Green Finance Institution, to make sure we can leverage in as much money from the private sector as we can in relation to this important area. But the government's got to play its role as well.
But Mr. Khan, can you tell Londoners that they will not see big increases in their council tax bills to pay for the green ambitions of London?
No, I've not got the tax-raising powers, even if I had the powers to do so. The council tax powers we have in London is focused upon areas that are really important to London. What we can't have is a situation where this really important issue to London, as climate change and air pollution, is paid for just by families and businesses. We need the government to step in as well.
OK, Mr. Sadiq Khan, thank you very much for your time.
Thanks. Stay safe.
Well, do stay with us, because coming up after the break, I'm going to be joined by the lecturer in international relations, Jen Allen, and Mohammed Addo, director of the think tank Power Shift Africa. We're going to be discussing if the UK is a role model on net zero and how cities like London can play a vital part in tackling climate change.
I'm Hannah Thomas-Peter, and I'm Sky's climate change correspondent. The UK is a world leader in wind power. Power! Power! People! It's part of the Congo Basin rainforest, which is such an important ecosystem. It's known as the lungs of Africa. We aim to be the best and most trusted place for news. She doesn't really enjoy speaking to the press, and it wasn't clear right up until the last moment that she was going to sit down with me.
I might be just very naive, but I do believe that change is possible, otherwise we wouldn't be climate activists.
I'm confident for the last 30 years we have known how bad it is. I'm not here to apologize. I'm here to fight for the next step.
You can see just the piles and piles of stuff, these sofas and people's desks and children's books. And you can see inside this home here, people trying to sort out their home. It's just been devastating.
I think everything's at stake. The future of our planet, the future of the beauty around us, the future of you and me.
Did you know if we tried to use less energy, we could help reduce air pollution? What, like turning off the lights and stuff? Yeah.
The morning will be fine for most after patchy early rain over southern England clears, but there'll be showers in the north and west. They'll be wintry on northern hills. It will be much colder than recently, with a raw wind in the north and east bringing coastal gales. The afternoon will bring a few showers into the Midlands, but there'll be little change elsewhere. The push of clean, cold air from the northern Atlantic means the air pollution index, where 1 means low pollution and 10 means very high, will be low.
The Air Quality Report, sponsored by Philips Air Purifiers.
Hello and welcome back to the Daily Climate Show here on Sky News. Well, we're getting straight to discussing the climate issues of the day. We have with us the lecturer in international relations at Cardiff University, Jen Allen, and Mohamed Addo, director of think tank Power Shift Africa. Now, it's been a really big week, hasn't it? The UK government has set out its net zero strategy, said to be the most comprehensive plan of any major industrialised country. And with just days before the global gaze fixes firmly on Glasgow for COP26, is the strategy a good example to the world? I'm going to speak to you first, Mohamed, on this. It took a long time to get this document, didn't it? We kept waiting. It's a big, fat document outlining the government's plan. Is it worth the paper it's written on?
I don't think so. And I don't think anyone really wants to see a far-off net zero pledge that will supposedly balance the UK's emissions budget by mid-century, and by using tools, including unproven, techno-fixes. I think what we want to see is actually what the UK is going to do today, tomorrow, and every year to come to eliminate its major sources of emissions, including its continued fossil fuel production and use. To be able to address the current climate emergency, we need real plans, real solutions, real finance, and real zero for an urgent, just transition. So
clearly you don't think that is
2050.
Clearly, you don't think that's what this document represents. And what about you, Jen? I mean, the UK government likes to think of itself as a world leader here in its climate pledges. Is that delusional?
Well, you're right. It's been a big week. I think about a dozen or more policies were put out the last day, totaling over 1,800 pages. So we're all a bit in digestion mode right now and trying to figure out what it all means. It's definitely better than where we were. And it's definitely puts the UK in good stead when we compare it to other countries. It's not enough to get us to net zero, and there's still some policies in there missing, especially around investment. But we do have to admit, this is a serious piece of work that looks across the government in all of the departments and looks at what they can do and what their targets should be. So it's better than where we were, and it's a good step forward. It's just not quite enough yet.
And Mohammed, the key to all of this, isn't it, is credibility, because if government policy is credible, then you get private investment pouring in, and then you can encourage individuals to change their behaviour. And how far away do you think the government is from being credible on climate?
I think they've included some good stuff. So the strategy, of course, includes investment in expanding electric vehicles, something I think we shall celebrate and welcome. They start on offshore wind. They start on, the creation of green hydrogen. All these things are important. But what, the challenge that we will face is actually whether we can be able to even mobilize the funding that is required to be able to implement this strategy. I think this strategy is still seriously unfunded. It doesn't get us to zero. It doesn't get us to zero within the time frame that will allow us to hold global warming to below 1.5. And it needs the support of Treasury if it's going to be effective. I think what is going to help us is if we can actually mobilize the world government behind the strategy and be able to revise the strategy so that it gets us to real zero within a time frame that we can actually hold global warming to below 1.5. And so without funds that will actually allow this strategy to be delivered, I don't think it will live up to the hype. So the government is actually in danger of acting and promising us grand promises, but not delivering. And I think if it does that right, I think it will inspire the rest of the world and we'll see a race to the top.
And Jen, some of the sectors that Mohammed was mentioning there that are high points that the government's focused on are already profitable, aren't they? How does the government go about encouraging money into technologies which are still quite experimental, not yet profitable?
That's the big question. So there's a role for government to play in terms of providing initial investment. There's also a role for government to play in terms of an investment bank or a way to sort of nurture those technologies until they're commercially viable. There is a huge piece of this missing, which is how are they going to mobilize private investment into this? So as Mohammed has said, it's underfunded right now. We don't know where all this money is coming from. There's sort of an idea that the private sector is going to help out, but without a strategy to mobilize that private finance, we're not sure how we're going to hit most of these targets or fulfill a lot of these promises in the net zero plan.
Yeah, and there's trillions out there, sort of so-called savings glut. Well, let's move the conversation on. The UK wants to be a global leader on net zero, as we've been saying. Well, that is by 2050. London's mayor, however, Sadiq Khan, wants his city to be net zero by 2030. Now, that is ambitious, but with more than half of the world living in urban areas, cities and the people in them will need to play a crucial role in the green transition. And Mohammed, I'm interested to bring you in on this. You're talking to us from Nairobi. It's a city which has seen rapid urbanisation. There's a lot of work, isn't there, for your city to commit to its green potential?
Yeah, I think we in the developing world, I think what we're seeing is cities growing rapidly. And I think it's important that they grow, but they grow in a low carbon way. And we need to do everything to help our cities become greener rather than ending up to be big polluting metropolises. I think that will need to be re-engineered, later. And so I think it's important for us to get this message through that the way we've approached cities, we need to change our mindset about them. We need to change the design of our cities. I think people living and working together can help reduce emissions. And so what we need to do this time is create cities with a mixture of homes, shops and workplaces that are close to our commuting and shopping trips so that we can have them shorter. And we can actually be able to get to places by walking, by cycling, and having an effective public transport. I think if we redesign cities and do that in a way that we can actually help make the most out of the little space that we have, we're now seeing, particularly in Nairobi, and this is true for a lot of the developing country cities, a lot of migration to the major cities. And so space is scarce. And so what we need is modern blocks of flats that are efficient use of space, that can also be quite energy efficient. And if we build this with the right materials, with proper insulation, I think we can get our cities greener and help them contribute to the global efforts to tackle climate change.
Jen, I just want to bring you in here, talking about Sadiq Khan. He thinks he can go net zero by 2030. Is that just a gimmick or can he do it?
It's a tall ask, but cities are absolutely crucial. They're about 70% of global emissions. And if you think about cities like London, we tend to build on coastlines and around big rivers. And that's a big problem when we have sea level rise and flooding. So building resilience in cities is just as important as net zero. And it can't be overlooked when we're talking about cities and climate change.
OK, Jen Allen, Mohamed Addo, really good to have you both on the programme. Thank you. That is everything from us for today. Joining us on the show tomorrow to discuss all of the big issues will be Fatima Ibrahim from Green New Deal and also Bob Ward from Grantham Research Institute. Hope to see you tomorrow evening.